You are not the kind of guy who would be at a place like this at this time of the morning. But here you are, and you cannot say that the terrain is entirely unfamiliar, although the details are fuzzy. You are at a nightclub talking to a girl with a shaved head. The club is either Heartbreak or the Lizard Lounge. All might come clear if you could just slip into the bathroom and do a little more Bolivian marching powder.
This is the opening passage of J. McInerney's Bright Lights, Big City, the most well-known novel written in second-person point of view, where the primary pronoun is you. How did you feel about being inserted into the story? Were you transported into a different life? Or did you resist feeling, thinking, or doing things that don't match who you are? Did it suck you into the story, or shove you out? It's natural to tell a story in first person with the pronoun I. Then I open the door. Or to recount events someone else experienced using third person with the pronouns he, she, or they. Then he opened the door. But to say, then you open the door, that's an entirely different reading sensation. It's ethereal, hypnotic, tethering the reader to the words through their own presence in the story. When we talk about point of view, POV, we're looking at the narrator, who is telling the story. That is why true second-person POV is not simply the use of you in a narrative. Rather, the character refers to themselves as you, or the reader is playing the role of you. We'll examine that distinction later. Let's first explore the disadvantages and advantages of this perspective. It's easy to understand why many readers dislike second person. It can feel gimmicky, like the writer is trying too hard to be different, relying on style over substance. Second person may remind readers of game books like the Choose Your Own Adventure or Give Yourself Goosebumps series, where you decide to enter the void and turn to page 75. This POV might feel designed for video games, children's books, or interactive fiction. The appeal of the Choose Your Own Adventure type of self-insert fiction is that the reader has agency and controls the narrative through their decisions. But that's not the case for other second-person fiction, since the reader is forced along an already defined story path. It's not really about audience participation, but instead the experience of being an entirely different person. Second person naturally calls attention to itself. The you can distract readers and prevent them from becoming fully immersed in the story. Typically, unusual writing styles are easier for readers to stomach across short durations. But the pronoun you might grate on their nerves over the course of a 300-page novel. Some readers' initial reaction to that style of narration is defensiveness. It makes them feel that the author is asserting that they, the reader, are the ones feeling those emotions or carrying out those actions, which can be jarring if it contradicts their own personality. For example, if I said, "You stab your mother's arm, giddy at the prospect of gushing blood," you might be like, no thanks. In addition, second person is tough to pull off and less marketable. Agents and editors know it lacks widespread appeal, and they don't want readers leaving bad reviews just because they can't stand second person. Arguably, this is only an issue of familiarity, and perhaps this POV would be more widely accepted if it were used more often. I will tell you this, I love the closeness of second person, so there is an audience for it, even if it is small. So the main disadvantages of second person are that it can be gimmicky. It calls attention to itself and seems pretentious. Uncomfortable. It can be a turnoff for some readers. Unmarketable. It's a hard sell to publishers for the above reasons. While there are a few downsides to second person, this point of view can change the entire texture of a story and make for a fascinating reading journey. How many novels do you know that are written in second person? Probably very few, and that's an appealing part of this POV. Not many people write in second person, so it makes your story immediately stand out, capturing the reader's attention. Professor Brian Richardson discussed this phenomenon in his book Unnatural Voices. The second person is a playful form, original, transgressive, and illuminating, that is always conscious of its unusual own status, and often disguises itself, playing on the boundaries of other narrative voices. The opening of Bright Lights, Big City has an intense, even uncomfortable level of closeness. And that's one of the advantages of second person. The reader can fall into a hypnotic state and glide into another body, another mind. They become even closer to the character than they would be in first person. Emotional intensity is a hallmark of second person, with that paradox of extreme closeness and distance. People react viscerally to reading, "She caresses you," whether that reaction is positive or negative. But the author's intent can be muddled. Bright Lights, Big City is about a writer whose dead-end job, cocaine addiction, and recent breakup make for a dark, cynical tone. So is the narrator addressing himself at a distance? Or is the character meant to be a surrogate for the reader? Or is there an outside narrator telling this character's story, referring to him as you? Supposedly, the novel began as a brief journal entry that McInerney wrote after a long night of partying, where he referred to himself as you. Later, he needed to submit a short story for the Paris Review, and he found that paragraph again, writing out an entire story in that same second-person voice. Thus, the book is almost a disguised memoir, the use of second person giving McInerney some narrative distance when it came to being truthful about the highs and lows of his life. Critic Michael Bourne praises the layers of McInerney's second-person POV. By telling his own story through a fictional avatar called You, McInerney manages the trick of creating three characters from one protagonist. On the one hand, the character is Jay McInerney, a real person who experienced misadventures very similar to those described in the book, and who thus possesses the credibility granted to any memoirist. At the same time, he is a fictional construct for whom all the traditional rules of narrative apply. We can laugh at his foibles and voyeuristically feel his pain, all the while knowing he isn't real. But finally, this is the magic part. He is literally you, each and every one of McInerney's readers. Unlike first or third, second person immediately begs the question of why did the author make this narrative choice? The reader digs for meaning as a result, peeling back those story layers and examining the characters on a psychological level. While second person is a risky move for writers, it can have immense payoffs, with the primary advantages being that it's unique. The story stands out from the crowd. Intense. It yanks the reader into the story. Complex. It adds another layer of meaning. Second person isn't as straightforward as it seems, because the use of the pronoun you doesn't automatically mean that the reader should insert themselves into the story. Sometimes you refers to another character, or the main character is talking about their past selves. Other times, you plays a combination of roles, like in Bright Lights, Big City. With those nuances in mind, let's unpack 5 possible variations for using the pronoun you in a fictional context. These are my names for these forms, and not necessarily terms you'll find in a textbook. Audience address. An omniscient narrator, or the protagonist, is talking to the reader directly. They are aware that they're telling a story. The you is the reader outside the text. Character address. The story is told in first person, but the protagonist is talking to another character using you. The you is not the reader. Quick side note, these first two aren't technically second person, but many people commonly mistake them for being that, which is why I'm covering them here. Reader insert. The reader is meant to be the main character. The you is literally the reader living the story. Distant narration. The protagonist is referring to themselves as you to create emotional distance. The you is not the reader. Hypothetical. The story is phrased like a how-to article and is meant to address the audience in a general way. The you could be the reader or the character, but in a more distant sense. First, let's look at audience address. Personally, I don't consider this to be true second person, because the point of view character is often speaking in first person. Rather, it's a narrative intrusion from the author or character who's telling the story. It's sometimes known as breaking the fourth wall, where the author breaks the invisible wall, separating the characters from the audience by acknowledging the reader's existence. In children's novels especially, the first-person narrator might interrupt the action to talk to the reader, like in Brandon Sanderson's Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarians.
If you've never faced such a situation, then you'll simply have to take my word. If, on the other hand, you have faced such a situation, then you are probably dead and aren't likely to be reading this.
Audience address can also involve the present-day narrator adding commentary on the story they're telling from the past. Other times, a peripheral character tells the story, with their role in the actual plot being minimal or non-existent. They might speak to the reader at the beginning and end, sometimes with short asides throughout. This is a type of framing device, where the main story is sandwiched by a secondary one. In The Book Thief by Markus Zusak, Death is the story's omniscient narrator. In his occasional chapters, which are written in first person, he gives context for the main narrative of a young girl growing up during World War II. The novel opens with Death directly addressing the reader.
I could introduce myself properly, but it's not really necessary. You will know me well enough and soon enough, depending on a diverse range of variables. It suffices to say that at some point in time, I will be standing over you, as genially as possible. Your soul will be in my arms. A color will be perched on my shoulder. I will carry you gently away.
This framing device bookends the story with Death's constant presence and his role in the characters' lives. It makes sense for Death to address the reader, since he is quite literally all-seeing and all-knowing. Addressing the audience is a form of metafiction, where the character is fully aware that they're telling a story, as in a fictional diary or memoir. Clive Barker uses this technique in Mr. Begone, the memoir of a demon.
Burn this book. Go on, quickly while there's still time. Burn it. Don't look at another word. Did you hear me? Not one more word. Why are you waiting? It's not that difficult. Just stop reading and burn the book. It's for your own good, believe me. No, I can't explain why. We don't have time for explanations. Every syllable that you let your eyes wander over gets you into more and more trouble. And when I say trouble, I mean things so terrifying your sanity won't hold once you see them, feel them. You'll go mad.
Audience address makes the story feel like a conversation between the character and reader. However, it grates on some readers' nerves and takes them out of the story. I advise using this technique sparingly, or as part of a larger frame narrative, rather than directly addressing the reader as you for the entire book. Audience address has a first-person narrator talking to the reader, but character address has a first-person narrator talking to or about another character. In that sense, I don't consider this to be second person either, but rather a form of direct address. Instead of the pronoun you referring to the protagonist or the reader, it refers to a secondary character within the story. Lucy Christopher's novel, Stolen, takes the form of a letter that a young girl writes to her kidnapper, where she directly addresses him as you. There's no breaking the fourth wall here. The reader is still looking in from outside the story, rather than being part of it. In You by Caroline Kepnes, a creepy bookseller named Joe is the novel's first-person narrator. From the very first page, he internally refers to Beck, a woman he becomes obsessed with, as you.
You walk into the bookstore, and you keep your hand on the door to make sure it doesn't slam. You smile, embarrassed to be a nice girl. And your nails are bare, and your V-neck sweater is beige, and it's impossible to know if you're wearing a bra, but I don't think that you are. You're so clean that you're dirty, and you murmur your first word to me. Hello. When most people would just pass by, but not you. In your loose pink jeans, a pink spun from Charlotte's Web, and where did you come from?
This direct address adds to the disturbing nature of Joe's narration. It's overly personal when he barely knows this woman. His mental undressing of her and assumptions about her intentions show that she's the intended audience of his narration, the singular focus of his obsession. Narratives that address a character often take the form of a diary, letter, memoir, or confession. American Spy by Lauren Wilkinson clarifies early on that the you refers to the narrator's two young sons.
Not caring about the blood anymore, I crouched to put my arms around you both. I held you for as long as I could and kissed you. Then I quickly packed a backpack and shepherded the two of you and the dog out into the hall. You both tensed at the sight of the policeman. Tommy, I had to pick you up because you wouldn't walk.
A few pages later, the narrator reveals that this whole story about her past is a letter she's writing for her sons to read when they're older. Character address is easy to spot, because the first-person narrator will usually hint at who they're speaking to within the first few pages. In The Friend by Sigrid Nunez, the first-person narrator speaks directly to her friend who committed suicide, narrating on the first page, "This was the last thing you and I talked about while you were still alive." Direct address reveals a lot about the characters and their closest relationships, whether it's between a stalker and his prey, a mother and her sons, or a woman speaking to her dead friend. How a character speaks or acts toward a specific audience shows how they feel about that individual and gives the reader deeper insights into the narrator's thoughts. The form most people think of when second person is mentioned are stories where the you turns the reader into the main character. You are running a re-election campaign for the 1st Congressional District in Virginia, opens Jessica Anthony's novel Enter the Aardvark. The narrator can be called a reader insert, because the reader is meant to imagine themselves as the character, to slip into his skin. This can have either a magnetic or a disorienting effect, as editor Louise Harnby explains. It's powerful because it places readers at the heart of the story, and yet we, the you, know less than the narrator. That can create a sense of immediacy, but almost amnesiac dislocation. We have to discover what we think, see, know, and do. And if we don't identify with the you, if we feel implicated rather than attached, we can be pulled out of the story rather than brought deeper into it. Sometimes the intention of second person is to make the reader identify more deeply with the point of view character. Jeff Vandermeer's Acceptance features 3 character perspectives, one in first, one in second, and one in third. This not only helps the author differentiate the characters, but also amplifies the trippy, mind-bending effect of Vandermeer's sci-fi horror blend.
There's a place that as a kid you called the farthest most point. The most distant you could get, the place that when you stood there you could pretend you were the only person in the world. Being there made you wary, but it also put a kind of peace into you, a sense of security. Beyond that point, in either direction, you were always returning, and are returning still.
In an interview with Electric Lit, Vandermeer comments, "I think second person is really misunderstood, possibly because in bad examples the writer is saying continually, you this, you that. Just like first person shouldn't be all I, second person requires you to be kind of subsumed in such a way that the reader finds it invisible after a while." Erin Morgenstern follows that principle in opening her fantasy novel The Night Circus with a wide lens view of the circus setting before using you on the second page. With that slight delay, the effect is less disorienting and more like we're experiencing the event in real time.
Your curiosity got the better of you, as curiosity is wont to do. You stand in the fading light, the scarf around your neck pulled up against the chilly evening breeze, waiting to see for yourself exactly what kind of circus only opens once the sun sets. The ticket booth, clearly visible behind the gates, is closed and barred. The tents are still, save for when they ripple ever so slightly in the wind. The only movement within the circus is the clock that ticks by the passing minutes, if such a wonder of sculpture can even be called a clock. The circus looks abandoned and empty, but you think perhaps you can smell caramel wafting through the evening breeze, beneath the crisp scent of the autumn leaves, a subtle sweetness at the edges of the cold.
Here, the you is not part of the main third-person storyline. These chapters are a framing device for showing an outsider's perspective of this magical world. This affords the reader an external view of someone experiencing the circus for the first time, that sense of wonder, mystery, and curiosity. The word you draws the reader deeper into the story by inviting them to imagine attending this magical circus themselves. I feel like I'm standing outside those gates, smelling the caramel wafting on an autumn breeze. These second-person sections are a way for the author to develop the atmosphere and world building. When the reader is you, they live vicariously. It positions them to be more empathetic toward the narrator in a way that third and first person might not. In Bright Light's Big City, it's easy to judge the narrator's self-serving, drug-addled pursuits. But because of that reader insert effect, the audience might be more apt to put themselves in the protagonist's shoes, observing and experiencing rather than judging and criticizing. Second person is often paired with present tense narration, you jump, rather than the past tense of you jumped. This lends the story an immediacy. You, the reader, are living in the moment. However, instead of creating characters who are blank slates, authors often imbue the reader insert figure with a distinct personality and backstory, as Tom Robbins does in his novel Half Asleep in Frog Pajamas.
The day the stock market falls out of bed and breaks its back is the worst day of your life. Or so you think. It isn't the worst day of your life, but you think it is. And when you give voice to that thought, it is with conviction and a minimum of rhetorical embellishment. This is the worst day of my life, you say as you drop a salted peanut into your double martini. On better days, you drink white wine and watch it sink.
By blurring the line between character and reader, the author is inviting the reader to perceive the world through another's eyes. In distant narration, you is the protagonist referring to themselves in second person. It's a hidden form of first person. The main character enters a dissociative state to create distance between themselves and the events of the story. This is especially true in stories where the protagonist faces trauma, with second person giving them psychological distance and a way to recount those difficult moments more objectively. The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz features two first-person perspectives, but one of the chapters opens with an italicized interlude in second person. You dread conversations with your mother. Those one-sided dressing downs. You figured that she's called you in to give you another earful about your diet. This use of second person in an otherwise first-person narrative creates some emotional distance for the narrator and talking about painful memories. Distant narration allows the narrator to be emotionally honest and vulnerable. Separating themselves from the story creates an out-of-body experience where they can pretend that these events happened to someone else. It's a method of self-protection. Kira Condis's flash fiction piece, As Seen on TV, an X-Ray literary magazine, captures that type of dissociative state. Your therapist at the University Health Center asks if you're happy, and you say yes. You tell her how your boyfriend took you out last night to your favorite restaurant with the spinach dip and steak frite. You tell her how he told you he loved you. Finally, you think, you've done enough for someone to love you. You don't tell her that when you went back to your apartment, he did it again. The thing where he says he doesn't expect sex, but that it would be foolish for him to be in a relationship without it, when there are so many girls who could give it to him. Poetry and nonfiction use this form as well, as Carmen Maria Machado does in portions of her memoir In the Dream House, which documents her experience as a victim of domestic abuse. She explains how her use of second person is more about trauma than implicating the reader in an interview with Porterhouse Review. I think second person can have a lot of different functions, but in this book I think the you is more a reflection of trauma, of severance and separation. Actually, the first draft of the book was entirely in second person. And then I realized I wanted there to be a separation between the moments when I'm in the relationship, which works well in that second-person present tense, where you're trapped forever in this eternal thing, this eternal disconnect, this eternal dissociation, versus, the past and the present, or the present version of myself in the essay sections. So a narrator might refer to their past self as you, as a way of separating their present self from that former identity, especially when who they are now is vastly different from who they were back then. Second person as a type of distant narration has a powerful emotional impact. It mimics the strangeness of the mind examining itself, and calls attention to our own understanding of consciousness. Hypothetical second person is perhaps the rarest form, and feels different from other types. Professor Brian Richardson describes 3 of its common features, although a story won't necessarily include all of them. The consistent use of the imperative, the frequent employment of the future tense, and the unambiguous distinction between the narrator and the narratee. Phrases like wash your hands are the imperative. They're commands, recommendations, like what I often use in these videos. Future tense entails sentences like, you will do this. The narrator speaks in terms of a hypothetical you, which is not directed at the reader specifically. Lori Moore's short story collection Self-Help contains several second-person stories that define this style, particularly her story, How to Be an Other Woman, which opens with clear instructions that use the imperative.
Meet in expensive beige raincoats on a pea-soupy night, like a detective movie. First, stand in front of Florsheim's 57th Street window. Press your face close to the glass. Watch the fake velvet Hummels inside revolving around the wingtips. Some white shoes like your father wears are propped up with garlands on a small mound of chemical snow. All the stores have closed. You can see your breath on the glass. Draw a peace sign. You are waiting for a bus.
The imperative verb form makes the actions feel more optional, only one path of many. This hypothetical language is perhaps more comfortable for some readers, because it's a staple of nonfiction articles and self-help books. Hypothetical second person also allows for that subsuming of the pronoun you that Jeff Vandermeer talked about. Lori Moore can begin sentences with verbs like meet, stand, and draw, instead of constantly having to write you meet, you stand, you draw. Other stories in the collection, like How, pair second person with the future tense. The sadness will die like an old dog. You will feel nothing but indifference. Since this is a story about a relationship gone sour, the future tense of will creates a sense of inevitability about the couple's breakup. The novel How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia by Mohsin Hamid uses a self-help book conceit, and in certain parts the narrator asserts universal truths.
But when you read a book, what you see are black squiggles on pulped wood, or, increasingly, dark pixels on a pale screen. To transform these icons into characters and events, you must imagine. And when you imagine, you create.
We use this type of generalized second person all the time in everyday speech, when we say things like, you never know what's going to happen. The you is unspecified and universal, speaking to a general audience. It's the same you we often hear in songs and advertisements. This type of second person doesn't usually bother people because we can choose whether or not we want to be included in that general you. Hypothetical second person is probably the least used form because it adds another layer of complexity to an already complex POV. Regardless of the author's intent, readers may assume that you refers to themselves rather than the character. But that fuzzy distinction can be part of the fun of second person. That's where blending forms of second person comes in. To quote Professor Brian Richardson, one of the more unsettling features of this mode of narration is that this distinction can be collapsed whenever the you could refer to the reader as well as the protagonist. There's no better example than Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, which opens with you, the reader, opening the book, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler.
You are about to begin reading Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Relax. Concentrate. Dispel every other thought. Let the world around you fade. Best to close the door. The TV is always on in the next room. Tell the others right away, no, I don't want to watch TV. Raise your voice. They won't hear you otherwise. I'm reading. I don't want to be disturbed. Maybe they haven't heard you with all that racket. Speak louder. Yell, I'm beginning to read Italo Calvino's new novel. Or, if you prefer, don't say anything. Just hope they'll leave you alone.
Calvino is breaking the fourth wall by acknowledging that this is a work of fiction, that the reader is literally reading. There's also that use of the instructional imperative, like in Lori Moore's short story. However, there are actually two yous in this novel, the reader insert and the protagonist. Through these two overlapping forms of second person, Calvino is exploring the way that readers experience reading. Second person demands closer analysis because of these complexities. That's why it's such an effective POV for metafictional works, stories about storytelling. Writer Darlene Riley phrases it beautifully. But it goes beyond that, into a realm you've never explored before, the metafiction that makes you puzzle about the stylistic choices of the writer and the relationship between fiction and reality. And you begin to question your own existence because you may be living in the Matrix. Another ambiguous use of second person appears in the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. In the first chapter, it feels like a form of distant second person narration.
You are she. She is you. You are Esun, remember? The woman whose son is dead. You're an Orogene who's been living in the little nothing town of Terimo for 10 years. Only 3 people here know what you are, and 2 of them you gave birth to.
At first, I interpreted this passage as the character talking to herself, creating some emotional distance from the trauma of her son's death. But as the story goes on, it's revealed that these chapters were narrated by another character entirely, someone who knows Essen's whole life story well enough to tell it. Thus, it's an obscured form of first person with that direct address to a character, but it feels like full-on second person as you're reading it. To help put these 5 approaches in context, let's look at how a single scenario can differ depending on which form of you the writer is using. Say we have a story about a married couple. Here's the audience address version. My wife and I have been married for 20 years. You've probably heard a variation of my story a million times. Husband has a midlife crisis and buys a new Corvette, while his wife starts nagging the kids about grandchildren. The first-person narrator is directly addressing the outside reader as you. If the narrator instead talks directly to the wife, we can turn it into a character address. You and I have been married for 20 years. I buy a new Corvette, and you start nagging the kids about grandchildren. If we want to turn the reader into a character who's living the story, we can use you as the primary pronoun. You have been married to your wife for 20 years. You buy a new Corvette, and your wife starts nagging the kids about grandchildren. The reader insert version could also be interpreted as a form of distant narration, where a character is viewing their own life from a distance. The distinction between reader insert and distant narration largely depends on the author's intentions. If it's a traumatic and highly personal story, it's more likely that the author is using distant narration as an emotional buffer for the narrator, Here's what that might look like. Before the accident, you never struggled to articulate your opinions. The right word was always waiting on your tongue. Now you have been married to your wife for 20 years, and you don't talk. Instead, you buy a new Corvette, and your wife starts nagging the kids about grandchildren. In this case, the reader isn't necessarily expected to stand in the narrator's shoes. It's more like the narrator is trying to observe their past self objectively and talk about difficult experiences. Lastly, the hypothetical form uses commands, like in an instruction manual. Be married for 20 years. Buy a new Corvette. Listen to your wife nag the kids about grandchildren. Some stories blend these different forms, so look at these options more as a spectrum than hard lines. Second person is a readerly paradox. It's intimate and intense for some, alienating and annoying for others. If you want to write in second person, you might have a better chance of using it effectively in short stories or novellas, since the reader only has to endure the unusual narration for a limited number of words. Short fiction often has more leeway to be experimental for that reason. That being said, some literary magazines put second person on their list of hard no's. Leopard by Wells Tower is one of my favorite short stories written in second person. I've linked it in the description. In novel-length works, it can be less grating on the reader to use second person as a secondary point of view to the main narrative, meaning that the majority of the story is told in the traditional first or third person, with occasional chapters or scenes written in second person. For example, Brass, a novel by Jeanette L. Yu, is a mother-daughter tale where the mother's perspective is told in first, and the daughter's in second. The author notes that the daughter has little agency and feels forces outside her control will determine her fate. So second person echoes that distance the character feels from her own identity. Many established authors get away with using second person without really having a reason for it. They simply use it because it intuitively feels right for that particular story. But you'll see more success if you have a narrative purpose for using you. If you justify your narrative choices on the page, the reader will trust your abilities as a storyteller. They'll go, "Oh, okay, I see what the author's trying to do here. Now I'm totally along for the ride." As opposed to the reader thinking, "This pretentious writer's trying way too hard to be different." A great example of form matching function is the thriller novel Complicity by Ian Banks. The main characters are a journalist and a serial killer. The journalist's POV is written in first person, whereas the killer's POV is written in second. We see two versions of the same events, but the use of second person in the killer's perspective heightens the eerie tone.
You go downstairs and walk through the kitchen, where the two women sit tied to their chairs. You leave via the same window you entered by, walking calmly through the small back garden into the mews where the motorbike is parked. You hear the first faint, distant screams just as you take the bike's key from your pocket. You feel suddenly elated. You're glad you didn't have to hurt the women.
As editor Louise Harnaby notes, it's as if you're being addressed, as if you're complicit, which obviously ties back to the title of Complicity. The reader experiences the story in an entirely different way than they would have in third or first person. Here are my general tips for writing in second person. Use it in a short story or novella. For a novel, keep the primary point of view in first or third with occasional second person chapters. Understand what mode of second person you're using. Is you meant to be the character or the reader or both? Know your larger narrative purpose for using second person. How do you want the reader to feel? What effect are you trying to create? While many instructors caution against using second person, you won't know what works until you try it. So take risk and experiment. As a writing exercise, write a paragraph from the second person perspective of an everyday object. A toilet, a stapler, a book. Try it on for size and have fun. You never know what might spark a good story. You scroll down and click the comment box. You write your thoughts about stories written in second person, and you listen as Diane says, whatever you do, keep writing.